Granny was something else. Every so often, she would stop by and tell one of her stories. What I had learned through the years was, really, her life story. Granny grew up on a farm. Life was a little rough, but Granny simply accepted the chores as part of life. In a way, this hard work developed her character. She was pretty matter-of-fact about most things in life. I think she was about 10 when her uncle decided to have a laugh and teach her to shoot a gun. The guns were nothing new to Granny. The menfolk often went on hunting trips in the fall and talked about their rifles. Well, her uncle set up some tin cans and bottles on the fence and showed Granny how to load, aim, and trigger the bullets. Granny watched and listened carefully, ever interested in new skills. After all, one day she hoped to join the hunting parties. Well, Granny lifted the weighty rifle, aimed carefully, and squeezed the trigger gently as instructed. The gun fired and knocked Granny backward on the ground. Naturally, her uncle broke out laughing. Granny was a bit surprised at the kick the gun had, as well as a little miffed at her uncle's lack of warning her. Well, not to be made a fool of, Granny got up, looked sternly through the gun's guide, braced herself, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet fired, Granny took the kick back, and the bullet slammed right through the center of the tin can she was aiming at. Well, her uncle's smirk suddenly turned to surprise as he promptly praised her shot. Granny, enjoying the result, decided to try again. This time, her uncle provided more detailed coaching. Granny followed most of the advice, occasionally getting a little annoyed at the more patronizing suggestions, and took slow aim at one of the bottles. Bracing herself once again, Granny slowly squeezed the trigger and let the bullet fly. The bottle shattered completely. A dead center hit. 2 perfect shots in a row. Granny's uncle couldn't believe such luck, so he instructed Granny to reload and shoot 2 in a row. That would break the spell of confidence. Now, Granny wasn't too sure she could shoot 2 in a row, but she was up for most any challenge. So, she loaded the rifle, took aim, then a sly grin came across her face. She looked at her uncle for a second, maybe to unnerve him, then resumed taking aim. Granny stood there for several seconds like a statue. Just before her uncle was going to say something, she shot the rifle, moved slightly, and shot again. Her uncle had been looking at Granny instead of the targets, so he hadn't seen which items Granny was aiming at. After the 2 shots were done, her uncle looked at the fence and saw all the targets sitting in place. Thinking Granny had missed them, he gave her a sorrowful look and began walking to the targets. When he looked over the targets, he saw one tin can had a hole in it. The bullet had whizzed right through without disturbing it from the fence. Granny had hit one can perfectly, but missed the other. The Granny was a little disappointed at missing one target, but her uncle's attitude seemed to suggest she did better than expected. That night at supper, that's all her uncle could talk about. Granny was enjoying the praise despite a bit of embarrassment from the added attention. As work on the farm continued as normal as the years passed, occasionally when things died down, usually in the winter and usually when her parents went to town for supplies, Granny would practice shooting the rifle in hopes of joining the hunting party when she was older. It wasn't too many more years until Granny was able to convince her father and uncle to join them on a hunt. She cleaned up the old spare rifle and carried it into the woods with as much confidence as she could muster. Not that Granny didn't lack any confidence, It's just that this was the first time she went hunting and wasn't sure what to expect. Her father managed to get a nice buck, and after 2 tries, her uncle managed to bring down a doe. But Granny felt like she was just tagging along, having had no opportunities come her way. Her father, seeing that Granny was down a bit, decided to do one more trip in the woods and see if he could teach Granny that not every hunt was successful. Granny and her father set off on a well-used trail. All the while, Granny's father was providing little snippets of his past disappointing hunting trips. He stopped dead in his talk when he heard a faint rustling. They both panned the forest. There, standing a few hundred yards away, was a huge buck. About the time Granny's father began to point it out, Granny had raised her rifle, took aim, and shot a bullet. "Too far, too quick," her father said. Just then, the buck collapsed. Granny and the father looked at each other in total amazement, then bounded over to the buck. It was 8 points if it was a day, and Granny's bullet had hit dead on the carotid artery. Amazing luck. As you can imagine, after that, Granny was not only invited, but expected to go on future hunting trips, and the story of her first buck occasionally came up at family gatherings. Each time the story was told by the men folk, more legend than fact was added. Granny, being a bit more practical of things, usually either laughed it off or dismissed it as foolish tales. But such legends were hard to avoid when Granny was usually the better shot in the hunting party. By this time, Granny was leaving her teens and considering her future. The war had ended and life seemed to be getting easier. It was about this time that she met Grandpa, just out of the military and working through college. Not long after graduation, he got a job offer at a large corporation in a city several hundred miles away. Good money and a secure position. Granny had been dating Grandpa the entire time he was in college, but it was time. Grandpa proposed, and Granny accepted. They moved into a newly built suburb outside the city, had kids, and lived an almost stereotypical life. Eventually, the kids grew up, went to college, and moved on with their lives. Grandpa and Grandma finally had time to enjoy more things. Oh yes, they occasionally went hunting, but not as often as they had in the past. But it was nice to get back into the woods. Most of their forays were to visit their grandchildren or attend family functions. Things get a bit sad here. You see, not many years after Grandpa retired, he died. Granny was left with a big house in the suburbs and quite a bit of pension and savings to live on. Occasionally her kids would come for a visit. Granny enjoyed the company, but soon the house was empty and silent again.